couple of questions. Actually, the survey was conducted by Dr. Fredman. One of the things, or two things that came out of that survey was that less than 50% of our faculty wanted help on how to include inclusion and diversity in research and even in teaching. And about less than 40% needed help on how to include diversity and inclusion in research. And so based on that, we have some of these things that we are targeting and trying to bring experts to help us and help us as colleagues, as professors, to address some of those concerns or some of those needs that we identified in that survey. And so that's why when I told Natalia, I said, this is what we are looking for. Search for an individual that has done some research in this area. It's a very unique area because not all of us know how to do these things. And so it is really, really an honor for me to introduce this colleague, Dr. Brian Bott, as an assistant professor at the University of Iowa. Is that the Iowa State or not University of Iowa? Iowa State. Iowa State, okay. Iowa State. Before then, he was he did his postdoc at the National Academy of Education and Spencer postdoctoral fellowship and the National Science Foundation Early Career Award recipient. We are very, very attracted to him because of his work. He has studied the experiences of various students in STEM and institutional policies and practices that influence students' educational and workforce pathways. And my colleague here, Dr. Brown, will be talking about alternative pathways for students. And so this is one of the things that we try to address in our program to create opportunities and pathways for students. He also investigates participation in research experiences. This is one of the reasons he's here. And through his program of research, Brian seeks to provide new understandings of the complexity of science participation. Right? So the aim here is to start to understand and to promote students' participation in what you do as professors in research, and also how you create pathways for these students. For the implication of this work, have the capacity to improve student-to-faculty relationship and interaction. And also some recommendations as he's going to share with us interactively on how we can do it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Bott, and hopefully you will have something to take away from it.
Thank you. Absolutely. All right, so thank you all for being here. Also, thank you, Dr. Wasu and Natalia, for the invitation, the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you all for being here and sharing this time with me. And also want to thank those who will watch this video in the future. Also, thanks to the Swanton School of Engineering leadership. I am extremely impressed by the commitment to diversity and inclusion and the offerings that you all have had. Your presence here this is very symbolic of the direction and the movement that this school is headed, and it's extremely exciting to be a part of that. So thank you all for the commitment to diversity and inclusion. So before I go too far, just so I can get a pulse of who's here, if you're a graduate student, can you raise your hand? Perfect. What about a faculty member? Okay, the majority it looks like. Staff? Administrators? Other? Okay. All right. So majority faculty members, staff members, and then I also saw some students. So what I am aware of is that there are people who likely could benefit from this conversation that we're going to have, but they can't be here for whatever reason. I am okay with people using their smartphones or whatever technology you have to engage people who are not here. So that is my Twitter handle. It's Brian_A_Burt. So today we're going to talk about incorporating inclusivity in your research practice. And I have the brackets around research because you're going to learn that we're going to talk about research and research practice. Because as I was developing this presentation, I was thinking that there's actually something, I think that there's nuanced differences between research and research practice. They work together, but I think that they're different. And we need to talk about how to be inclusive in both spaces to understand how they work together. This is going to be a very, very interactive workshop, mainly because when I saw all of your offerings, you all did some great, great thinking work around topics of diversity and inclusion and where it comes into play. And so what we're going to spend the first part of our conversation together is we're going to actually discuss some of the things that you previously learned and some of the things that you've previously begun putting into practice. We're going to talk about that stuff because it's those early conversations about diversity and inclusion that I believe when we leverage that learning, it'll be an easier transition into thinking about how do we transition into or how can we leverage existing knowledge into our research and our research practice. So I must admit, this is an underexplored topic. In fact, I have never sat in another presentation like the one that we're going to do today. So I want to admit up front, there are no right answers. There are no right answers. So our challenge is going to have to be to dismiss any inner thoughts of, am I getting it right? Am I doing something right? Because there is no right answer. So our challenge and our goal today is to build shared understandings and learn from each other to move forward with this idea of inclusivity in research and research practice. Again, I do think that you all are on the forefront of very interesting things in terms of STEM, as well as the field of higher education to be engaging in this conversation. So there are no right answers. All right. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to revisit principles of diversity and inclusion. We're going to reflect on current experiences of creating inclusive classrooms, things that you all are already doing, or at least things that you've been thinking about. Then we're going to leverage that information into how to be inclusive in research and research practice. Then we'll generate ideas together of inclusivity in your research and your research practice. Oops. From there, we'll have some time so that you can begin to think individually. How might you do it in your own practice, whether that be your classroom, your research groups, your interactions with your peers, or even your staff members. We'll have some time to develop individualized action plans. And then we'll have some closing activities that will help us to reflect on what we talked about, as well as some steps for moving forward. All right, so because this is going to be a very interactive workshop, again, it will be helpful if you are sitting near somebody who you can engage in conversation. Our first conversation starts with, why are diversity and inclusivity important in teaching and learning environments? So let's take a few minutes for you to turn to a nearby partner and have a conversation about that. And then we'll come back together as a big group. Okay, let's come back together. Let's come back together. Okay, so let's hear some of the conversations that you had. in your conversation. Why are diversity and inclusion important in teaching and learning environments? And understand that I left teaching and learning environments very broad, right? So that means that it can be a number of contexts. But why is it important? Why are they important? There are no wrong answers. Okay.
We talked about how diverse groups can enrich the learning environment, whether it's teaching or research activity being done, because people have different perspectives, contributes to better outcome from the research activity or teaching activity.
So we heard about different perspectives, right? Okay. All right, 1, 2. Yes.
So corollary to that is, I can readily see if the environment is perfectly homogeneous, there is going to be a clear tendency of getting comfortable and not doing this extra work. If there is diversity of opinions, everybody is on the edge to try to defend their point of view, and they work a little bit harder to defend it. And that to me is healthy, as opposed to just being comfortable with something they are homogeneous.
Interesting. So I'm only going to not push in a bad way, but I want to hear a little bit more. When people, so you mentioned about being comfortable, and when people aren't comfortable, then you have to defend your work a little bit more, right? And your argument is that it's in that defending of the work that you have a richer product. But most people actually don't like challenge. Healthy challenge.
But if I want to defend my ideas, I better do the research and come up with logical things. That will make that conversation that much richer.
And in those conversations with people who are not like you or have different ideas, it also forces you to have to think differently and explain it differently. So not necessarily defending in a combative way, but just figuring out different ways of communicating your ideas, right? Okay, very good. Yes?
We talked a lot about inclusivity, and when you're in an environment that's inclusive, you feel more comfortable, and so you share your ideas.
Thank you. Maybe 2 more ideas? Why are diversity and inclusion important in teaching and learning environments? Yes.
So David brought up that diversity among the faculty is important. So for students to have somebody.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
So that students have somebody on the faculty that they can work with.
So there's also some practicality of having people who look different, right? And think different, right? Okay. As a way of connecting with students. All right. One more. Did I see one more hand? Yes.
So to increase diversity and inclusivity, that basically plays itself forward to making a more equitable society in general, and giving opportunities to those who might not have had the same opportunities otherwise. There's a lot of inequity in the world. You can kind of attempt to balance that out by boosting diversity.
So feel like I'm hearing you say is when people are intentional about inclusivity and diversity, it helps to promote more equitable practices, right? Is that accurate?
I didn't necessarily mean practices.
Okay.
But to present the opportunities.
Okay.
That might not be there otherwise.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. I also heard some other great ideas, but trust me, there'll be other opportunities for you to share, so it's okay. All right, so now I want us to, so we've talked broadly about diversity and inclusion in teaching and learning environments. Now I want us to hone in a little bit more in thinking specifically about the classroom, okay? And the reason that I want to go here next is because I know that you all have had workshops specifically about classroom practices, right? So we're building this knowledge base before we get to research. So what I want to talk about now is, based on what you've learned from previous diversity workshops and or readings, what strategies have you implemented to create a more inclusive classroom? And then I'll give you some other prompts that you can think about as well. What strategies did you try? In what ways were the strategies successful? And in what ways were the strategies limited, and why? So I'd like you to have those conversations again with whoever you're having these, your partners or your triads. Okay, I was hearing some sprinkles of great different practices or strategies that you all have implemented and tried. So let's try and share some of these. I don't necessarily say best practices. I generally say promising practices, because I don't think there's really anything that's best yet. But what are some examples of some promising practices or some strategies that you've tried? And let's have a conversation about that. And then I'll also share some practices or some strategies that I've tried as well. Yes?
Well, so to increase inclusivity, one of the things I've tried to do is some level of problem-based learning, because in really large classes, I think students can feel lost, in the ocean of faces. But when you put them in smaller groups, they're more vocal about, problem solving and things, and then you feel more included in what's being taught. So that's one of the things that I've tried. It's been successful and very unsuccessful.
Well, so you say it was both successful and unsuccessful. What were the conditions that made it successful, and then what were the conditions that made it unsuccessful?
Well, basically, if the class is too large and you don't have any support people, TAs or something in the classroom, people get off track really quickly. And then we were also talking about sometimes people just don't get along inherently, and that's an issue.
Right.
Really make everything break down really quickly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Did you want to share?
Yeah, he gave two really good examples. He's not going to speak up, so I'm going to tell him, because I can do it.
Okay.
So one example is that in undergraduate course I teach on manufacturing, I typically get like 1 or 2 guest lectures per semester. And I realized after teaching a class for a few months that all the guest speakers are from like one demographic. So this semester I intentionally invited a female manufacturing engineer to give a guest lecture.
Okay. Why this particular? Why did you choose this particular person as the guest?
She's a bit graduate, very familiar with that. She was actually TA in that class before she graduated, and now she's a manufacturing engineer. So she was perfect for coming to the class.
And in addition, the fact that women tend to be underrepresented, historically underrepresented in engineering, makes that also a great model that women are doing exceptionally well and can do exceptionally well. So for some, the symbolism of seeing another woman was significant.
This is very important because manufacturing as an area doesn't have has this like image problem. And I just wanted to show them that.
That's right. In both of these examples, and I know we have a third one, in both of these examples, there was some intentionality. So that word's going to come up several times, intentionality and also forethought. Okay? These things aren't just happening by chance. Yes?
So the one thing that I did in the classroom was really to think about different learning styles and how students receive and then kind of create different knowledge. So we actually had an NSF funded project where we had the students create board games. So we intentionally didn't do kind of electronic games, we wanted them to do board games. And so the students were then required to either create a whole new board game or to take an existing board game, take different concepts that they learned in a class and to kind of configure that game. So one example is there's a Monopoly game and I teach a green building class, and so they had to think about the game mechanics of how the green building would work within the Monopoly game. And then and they had to create the instructions and like the objectives, and then another team had to play that. And then after the team played that, we actually packaged up the games and sent them to other universities. We were able to do like switches between universities. And we also worked with the Engineering Education Research Center so that they would come in and really do an assessment on the classroom climate to think about if the students were more engaged, if they were more vocal, if there were connections being made in learning.
Thank you. Okay, so I wasn't necessarily going to mention this, but I guess in hearing some conversations, it dawned on me of how perhaps some of the work that I do on Black men in engineering graduate programs lends itself to this topic about inclusive classrooms. So with my NSF Career Award, I study and I think a lot about the experiences of Black men in master's or PhD programs and how they're successful despite the barriers around them being successful in making progress. One of the findings in one of my recent pieces talks about the phenomenon of study groups. How many of you all participate in study groups in the past? No? I see some, okay, some heads shaking and some no's. So what's interesting about these men, and honestly, as I've talked to engineering deans and other people, I didn't really think of this as a finding. I thought this was probably something I was seeing from 1 or 2 people, but then it became 5 people, 13 people, 20 people, plus, across 4 leading engineering programs. And what they were saying is that they knew that they should be in a study group, but they were historically rejected from being in study groups from their non-Black peers. So they were, from their words, it was their white and their international Asian peers. So generally, as I'm writing about this now, I think about psychologically, what might that do to a student to know that you should be in a research group to be successful because everybody else is, but you can't get access to it because people reject you because they don't think you're smart enough based on your race and gender. So how does that relate to an inclusive classroom? Well, the practice that I've noticed is that the phenomena of study groups, at least for these men who have discussed it with me, say that the study groups are facilitated through the classroom. When the professors allow students to form organically. Have you all heard those words? Organically, right? Organically seems to be, when we allow the students to do that, that seems to be the easier practice. But perhaps it's not the most inclusive practice. Because what ends up sometimes happening is that students end up segregating themselves, whether it be by ability, by gender, by race and ethnicity, by citizenship status, right? So that's just one example that I guess I didn't think about until I heard some other people's conversations. But those type of intentionality, those can be, to some extent, I don't want to say remedied, but we can at least test it and see how it works. One way to do that is to intentionally pair people up. So in terms of how I do it in my own classroom, based on what I've learned from my research, is I generally ask students to count off, let's say 3s or 4s. And once I see how that lands out and how people have been grouped, in my mind, I'm thinking of ability. Like, is that an equitable group in terms of ability? Might people be able to challenge or support each other differently that I might need to intentionally make some switches? Might a group be heavily gendered that I might need to intentionally make some switches? And also by race. So that practice, at least for me, when I've tried it, allows me to have a little bit of randomization, right, of the groups, but also I'm still able to customize a little bit based on what I know about students' abilities in terms of writing or thinking, as well as other forms of diversity and inclusion. But I just want to share at least one example of how I practice it also in my classrooms. Before we move on, is there anybody else that has a burning desire to share a practice that they discussed? Okay. So I want to show, and I forgot to mention that this presentation today is an extension of a presentation that some colleagues and I gave at NCORE, the national, a national conference on race and ethnicity. Yes. Yes. Oh, no, absolutely not.
Sometimes I wonder, I completely agree with everything you said.
Uh-huh.
But one thing that I'm not sure how to answer is, how do you guard against doing it simply because the theory says you need to do it? So dot the I's and cross the T. But there's really no other intention but just to make it, just do it. And so really haven't accomplished. And how do you guard against just show that you're politically correct? How do you guard against that?
Is that how do you guard against implementing it correctly or knowing that you did it correctly?
No, you just do it because somebody's telling me this is the right way to do it. But really there's nothing underneath it. There's no substance.
If I interpret your question correctly, how I'm hearing your question, and please correct me, I feel like I'm hearing you say, what's my why and why I'm doing these practices,
Yeah.
right? Instead of just, we come to these workshops or your dean says, you all need to be more diverse and inclusive. What is my why of why I do it?
No.
Or why should people be thinking about this?
Say that, okay, in a group I need to have proper gender representation, this and that. Okay, so I'll get one oriental, one distinct. I'm done.
I see.
That accomplishes nothing in my mind.
I see. Well, I would actually agree. And I hope that didn't come across as if like I'm counting and making sure that there's a little bit of everything in every group. I don't necessarily know that I think of it like that, but I think it goes back to, I believe, our previous slide and the conversation of why is diversity and inclusion important? And most of you all agreed and said, it's important because diverse perspectives, generally different people have diverse perspectives, have different cultures, have different ideas, have different ways of thinking and being. And when we come together, it's that collective of different ideas that helps to boost learning. That's how I think of learning. And I can't necessarily impart that on everybody else, right? I think that people have different ideas of what learning is and why it's important. But at least from my perspective, that's why I like to be intentional in my groupings of students. Because I really do believe that when groups aren't homogenous, then people learn more. Does that answer your question at least a little bit? Okay.
It's just something that has to come from within, of course.
Absolutely. And I also think that people can learn it, right? And so I think what I'm hoping that we're having a conversation of and people are understanding is that there should be some attempts, and there likely are going to be some missteps. But how are we taking the time to think about it and to do something different? I mean, I always think about research and research groups. I was going to talk about this at the end, but I think of even a research group as developing a syllabus. Well, at least for my practice, if I'm teaching a class for the first time, it's kind of a test run with the intention that the next offering, I'm chipping away a little bit by a little bit to make it better and better each time. I hope that also other forms of diversity and inclusion is thought of in that same way, that we're not trying to do something that's a perfect fit that first time, but that we're slowly chipping away to get better and better at different practices. But I think what that takes is some intentionality, but also some being reflexive in our practice, and then making adjustments. Yes?
So to that point though, I know it's easy to say, well, I'm doing this because I believe in it, because it's the right thing to do. But doesn't research show that the more diversity, the more creative groups are, the more productive they will be? Like, to say that this thing on commission shows that the more diverse groups has more creativity, better results, and things like that. So if there's research backing it, then that's another reason to say you're not just doing it for the sake of doing it. Research shows it's actually more productive.
Correct. Yes. So, yes, it's not me saying it or how we feel, but now there also is empirical work that shows that not just about the research or like research groups or the classroom, but also about the the teaching and learning environment, higher education in general, right? There is an abundance of evidence now that's gone all the way to the Supreme Court of the significance of diversity and inclusion, right? So yes, thank you. So this is an image that is cited on the Iowa State Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching website. And I thought that it might be just good to, now I'm not necessarily saying that these are the only ways that these can be visually represented, because you actually might have different opinions, and we can talk about that. But this might be some ways to think about these concepts of inclusion, exclusion, segregation, and integration. Notice in the figure for inclusion that all types of people, let's say that those are people or ideas, right, are mixed together. And the difference perhaps of segregation is that they're all excluded. This is the homogeneous group, right? I'm sorry, the heterogeneous group. And then integration, still included, but still set apart. Does anybody think of these concepts differently? Yes?
So the one that says integration seems to me that it's segregation.
Okay. Yep. I could see that. Yes?
I would say the difference between the integration and segregation is that the segregation is provided with an external resource to themselves, and along with the main thread as having their own resources, whereas the integration is the same resource but split amongst them. Right? So like a small, obviously there's a smaller circle in that one, but the separate resources are what segregate, what speaks to segregation and integration.
Again, these are interpretations. Oh, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong. And in fact, this is one person's way of thinking about this. So we don't have to necessarily have consensus, but I want us to have some shared ideas of how people think about these concepts. So I want to give some, yes?
Talk about students organically.
Yes.
Form groups.
Uh-huh.
How do you so that you don't have integration of students organically and just
So the question is, how can we help our students to not necessarily form into segregated groups? For example, in the example of a study group. I think one way could be engaging in these type of conversations at the beginning of class, and perhaps even throughout class, in all of your classes or in all of our classes, about the benefits of having different perspectives and different opinions, right? I think as leaders, it starts with us modeling that it's important. And then when we see it perhaps not working, that we actually call it out. And not in a combative way, but at least acknowledging and letting students know that I'm seeing a pattern. That people are perhaps, in your choosing of study groups, that there are some people, that there are some commonalities, or that people are segregated. It might be okay to just call it out. Right? And again, it doesn't have to be in a combative way, but it at least can call it out and draw attention to it. Right? Because the thing is, if we don't, then generally how graduate students learn, when they become faculty members or leaders in corporations, they will incorporate practices in the ways that they were socialized. Right? So if we start to model different behaviors and practices, then they likely will carry those into their next professional practice as well. Okay, I just want to give some definitions before we transition into thinking about how to leverage this into our research and research practice. So diversity from the Iowa State site says that diversity references or is referred to individual differences, personality, learning styles, we heard learning styles, and life experiences, and group social differences, race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin, and the ability, as well as cultural, political, religious, and other affiliations. Inclusion, whereas might be the active, intentional, we're hearing that word a lot, intentional and ongoing engagement with diversity in the curriculum, in the co-curriculum, and in communities, intellectual, social, cultural, geographical, with which individuals might connect in ways that increase awareness, content knowledge, cognitive sophistication, and empathic understanding of the complex ways individuals interact within systems and institutions. And then we talked about inclusive classrooms, and I want to move on to talk about, so how do we translate what we've been talking about and what you've previously learned about inclusion? How do we leverage that into our own research and research practice? And before doing that, I just want to put this figure up so we can think about it. Is having diversity in the classroom the exact same as having diversity and inclusion in our research and research practice? Is it the same? No? I see a couple heads shaking of no's. Just one second. Is this a clarification question?
Yeah.
Oh, just one second. Let me get some new voices. I see a head shake and a head shake. Could one of you or both of you offer your opinions?
I guess I don't have a fully formed opinion, but I'm thinking in the classroom, a lot of times the motivation for a student being in a class isn't strongly related to their relation with the teacher, right? It's their relation with the subject material.
Okay.
Whereas in a research lab, there tends to be a stronger relationship between the student and, they want a good fit with their faculty advisor. And so sort of the motivations for the students kind of self-selecting into a class versus a lab are maybe a little bit different.
Okay, so there might be some self-selection issues that make it different. Yep.
I was just going to say that as an instructor, I have no control over who is or is not in my class. I have almost no flexibility on what does or does not need to be on the curriculum. In research, there is a lot more flexibility in all of these things.
That's right. I would say yes and, right? In that I would agree with your last statement in that as it relates to our research, and we're going to talk about research versus research practice, but in our research, we actually have agency to make decisions around diversity and inclusion. We also have that opportunity in the classroom, but we can't control who enrolls in the classroom, right? But we do have the agency to make certain choices in our research and our research practice that takes into consideration these elements. So what am I talking about? Let's first talk about research and research practice. Now, these are how I think about it. Oh, I'm sorry, and you had a question.
No, I didn't have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had a comment?
Yeah, conceptually, I don't see much difference.
Okay.
I do see the point that you mentioned is a mode of implementation.
Yes.
So what you can do, you cannot do. But conceptually, why you want to do it, they're roughly the same.
Okay, thank you. So this is how I think about it in terms of research and research practice. I think of inclusive research as a scientific product, right? So that's the main part, a scientific product with diversity and inclusion intentionality. A scientific product with diversity and inclusion intentionality. The inclusive research practice, how I think about it, are intentional practices of diversity and inclusion put into place to aid in the research process. So I think of research as the product, and I think of practice or practices as the steps or the strategies that you implement to support your research. Okay. All right. I see some faces that, and I can't gauge them. And that's okay. Any reactions? You may have a different way of thinking about it. Yes?
I agree with that.
Oh, how do you measure success? Good question. Okay. We will, let's save that question. Okay. Good. Other questions? Yes?
I see the distinction very clear.
Okay.
Why is it mandatory that everybody's research product need to be diverse and inclusion? You know what I'm saying is that I'm a biomedical researcher. Maybe my research, for some reason, I decided to focus only on male population, for whatever reason. I don't want to do any other populations. What others can do is, just because I've chosen, and they will be collecting somebody else from the community. But the practices I can still follow the rule, I mean, things in my name. Why is it mandatory that everybody must do that?
Okay. So, I will jump the gun and give a couple of examples from my own experience. Although the pedagogical strategy was going to have you think about it before giving my opinion, but I will give.
So we can wait. We can wait.
Okay. All right. Okay. So this is how I've operationalized it and how I think about it. And the reason is because as I was talking to Natalia, just talking about research, it seems too nuanced to me. So I think we have to separate out the product between the practices or from the practices. Okay, so I want us to take some time thinking about how this relates to your own field, right? Separating the product out from the practice. Let me give an example. And again, it's different given the type of work that we do. And I'm a social scientist, so I study people, right? So for me, to be inclusive, to have inclusive research as a product, I study black males in engineering. So the intersection between black men is an historically underrepresented population, right? But another topic that I do is generally kind of STEM broadly. One way that a practice that allows me to do the research or that helps me with my product is I cite other underrepresented scholars, right? I intentionally cite other underrepresented scholars. That's an inclusive way of thinking about one's research practice or their research, right? By championing other voices of people who are generally not heard. That's an example of a research practice. But again, that's kind of more context, that might be more context specific for my social science field, right? But I want to take some time thinking about not necessarily the why yet, because I guess I'm understanding that for some, the question of why is it important to think of inclusion and diversity in your research, I can understand why some people might still be wrestling with that, and I think that might be context specific or discipline specific. But I want us to think about or take some time to talk about ways or ideas of how you may think about inclusion and diversity in your research. And then what are the practices that you may incorporate to help diversify or have inclusivity in your research? Does that make sense? Yes? Yes, Dr. Watson.
Yeah, an observation. You know, the example that you gave,
Yes.
I'm kind of struggling
Okay.
how that is practical in engineering, in engineering research. I could see it in engineering educational research, but in typical engineering research, I'm struggling how, let's suppose you don't have diversity in that particular research. So how do you go about citing? How do you go about identifying and citing there? And going back to what Dr. Schroff said before, for what purpose? How does that
would say to that. Engineering, there's a knowledge base, right? The knowledge base has historically been built by white men as a knowledge base for the field. So you could think a way to have inclusion and diversity is to help as faculty and scholars are building new knowledge, also incorporate data from other scholars, other representation. Because from a diversity and inclusion perspective, that shows that knowledge creation is inclusive. That knowledge creation is just not white males, right, from the past, right? So in that example, it could be adding women in the same way that somebody might bring a woman to the class as a model, as a symbolic model that women can thrive in engineering by citing scholars who are not the traditional or what people might assume is what an engineer looks like. You're helping to expand understandings of what knowledge creation and who creates knowledge in engineering. You're helping to shape that and expand that. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Okay.
For example, Mustafa's example, I could see that we can easily do that. But I see your point in how you identify diversity in your particular research and try to cite there. That would be a really serious challenge.
A challenge isn't a bad thing. A challenge doesn't mean that it can't be done, but I do.
That's why I use the word challenge.
That's right.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so I want us to take a little bit of time, and again, I understand that this might be challenging thought work, especially if we haven't thought about this before. But I want us to take some time to think about in what ways can I think about diversity and inclusion in my research, and then research practice, separate. You might think of research practice as your research group, or who works with you, or ways that you work with students, or collaborations. I don't necessarily want to tell you how to think about it, but I want us to think about this together. And I understand that this might be difficult to think about. Okay? Let's take some time to think about your research and your research practice. All right. Again, thank you all for engaging in this very tough question. This is a very philosophical conversation. I understand that this is philosophical. And so one clarification that I was thinking about as I was talking with two colleagues in the back is I want to make it kind of clearer on the record that in my field, in my own research, I happen to study race and gender, the intersections between race and gender. But if you recall from the image here, there is so much more than just race and gender. So I was not asking you, how do you incorporate race and gender in your research? And I just want to be clear, and in talking that out loud, it came clear. I was hoping that it wasn't portrayed as such. Does anybody, or can maybe a couple people share, I know time is running out, but can we get some examples of how you thought about inclusive research and how you thought about the practices that can help support inclusive research? There are no right answers. I promise. Yes, please.
Maybe you can ask them undergraduates and give them an opportunity to go into research. And a lot of times, developments and groups who are usually shy and not sure if they can accept it or whatever. So try personally reaching out to them and see if they have interest.
Okay, so you said incorporating undergraduates in your research, right? And then because we pretty much know that there's likely going to be the overachievers who jump right on that opportunity, and some people may not, you said also as a faculty member or as somebody leading the project, also going up to students and encouraging them or inviting them, personally inviting them, right? How might that practice of inclusion lead to a more inclusive outcome, research outcome? sorry, did I hear something? Oh.
This is the connection I need.
Okay. How many undergraduates in your research provide a more inclusive product or outcome? Yep, they didn't hear it. Fresh ideas, new ideas. Generally, the younger scholars they know, number one, they can connect our theoretical and our very empirical ways of thinking and communicating. They can translate that to people outside the academy in ways that sometimes faculty, we lose that ability to communicate. Yep. They also, graduate students and undergrads, tend to be more connected to the fresher ideas and the fresher literature out there, right? So absolutely, that is a perfect example of being intentional to have undergrads as an example of an inclusive practice could lead to an inclusive research product. Absolutely. Another example.
I mean, I guess I have a question.
Yes.
So, inclusive research, is that something, so is inclusive research practice a means to the end that is inclusive research? Or do I need to, so I'm a structural engineer and I do region-wide resiliency. So in my mind, inclusive research would be looking at research that, as opposed to just looking at structural performance, looking at how the structural performance impacts people, let's say. So do I need to shape my research? I'm just a little bit confused.
I think it's both and. So let's say, I think it's both of how you said it. So you said that you have a research topic that is already inclusive, right? I would probably argue that the practice I would argue that the practices that you implemented, the thought processes and the bodies of literature that you read and the types of smaller projects that you did that allowed you to get to that inclusive topic, you were already incorporating inclusive practices that allowed you to arrive there. So I don't necessarily know that it's a chicken or egg, like which one comes first. But I do think that practices help to reinforce an inclusive research product.
Can I give an example?
Yes, please.
So Dr. May, Gary May, who's now at the school in California as the chancellor, he used to be the dean at Georgia Tech. He talked about an electrical engineering project where, you know how when you go to the bathroom and you put your hand under the faucet for the water to come out? Well, he said the original design was when you put your hand under the faucet, if your hands were darker, it didn't read it. So it didn't discern that your hand was there, so the water didn't come out. But you could turn your hand, or someone that had a lighter hand. So that was a product, that was an engineering product, that diversity and inclusion should have been considered in the practice, so that this product was not useful for just one person, but multiple.
Thank you. So in that example, the practice could have been to have focus groups, diverse focus groups, right? Who were trying out the product, right? It could have been people in the decision-making table that were brainstorming about different ideas to make sure that all different types of people could eventually benefit from this product. Exactly. That was a great example. Thank you. So I want to move on because I know that our time is limited. So here are some ideas that I'm borrowing from my colleagues and I when we did the presentation on the inclusive classroom, but some necessary components for fostering an inclusive research and research practice. An attitude conducive toward inclusive research. An environment that supports multiple forms of expression, trial and error, and feedback. And we talked about this, that it's not going to necessarily be perfect, but that it also takes some trial and error. A variety of methods to facilitate the achievement of all participants. Now, I left in teaching because I believe that when we do research or when we're also engaged with research groups, that is a form of teaching. And intentionally inclusive plan. So much like, and I mentioned this before, much like an intentional and thoughtful inclusive course syllabus, I think that we should be thinking about our research very intentionally in ways that we can incorporate diversity and inclusion in our work. Just like a syllabus, it generally takes a lot of time going through the articles or the chapters or the books and the resources that you're going to bring to your classroom. I think that same type of thought work can be done with our research groups or our collaborators for whom we're working with. So we don't have time for the reflection, but what we were going to do was take some time to reflect on today's workshop. And I was going to ask you, how was inclusivity modeled? Likely by me. And then how did you practice inclusivity through your interactions? So let me give some ideas from my observations of you all. Well, first of all, let me tackle that first one about how it was modeled. When you all first walked in, I tried to greet every single person individually. And I tried to let everybody know that you're welcome, or I'm glad that you're here, you're welcome, and thanks for your contributions. I tried to do that for everybody. I didn't ask what your PhD was in, or what field of study you're in, or what your pedigree was. I didn't ask any of that. I assumed that as you walked through the door, we were all equally talented and committed to this topic. Okay? Now, what did you do when you practiced? For some, I heard you all give introductions with each other of where you all come from, and so you could have a baseline information or baseline understanding of where you all come from. But how you all engaged with each other was you all engaged in conversations about inclusion in the classroom, inclusion in your research practice. You all treated each other as if you already had some baseline level of expertise. And that from that baseline of expertise, we were building shared knowledge. Think if you do that in your research practice with your students. Not thinking that they're an empty vessel or an empty bottle that we have to pour into, but what if you think of them as already a full bottle? Experts based on their culture, experts based on their backgrounds. And when you work with them, you're adding to them, or we're adding together, right? So from an inclusion and diversity perspective, it's seeing that other students or other individuals are already coming with expertise based on their unique backgrounds and their experiences. That also is a form of diversity and inclusion. All right, so I'm going to end. This is an old snapshot of my research group. My students, what you don't see is this is a blend of first year and second year master students, PhD students, full-time workers. That's also diversity. I didn't mention race and ethnicity, although that is, and gender. You can see that as well. But there are lots of different dimensions of diversity that were very intentional in how I wanted to design and self-select my group, not self-select, intentionally select members from my group. What you can't see from the picture is their diversity of thought, including those who very actively were competent in pushing back on me and asking really great questions. I knew that those types of people would also be necessary for my research group and my work, right? Because as I'm working on issues related to black men, having people with other perspectives and other ways of seeing it makes me, as we said in the beginning, it forces me to better clarify the arguments that I'm making. Right? So that's just, I wanted to end by showing kind of how I think about diversity and inclusion from a number of dimensions, not just race and ethnicity. Okay. I'm going to leave you with some, we're not going to do the closing activity that I wanted to do, but I'm going to leave you with some things to think about. What's one thing that you learned from today's workshop? I know that there was a lot of information and philosophical conversations. But perhaps reflect, maybe not now, but later on. What's one thing that you learned? What's one thing that concerns you about incorporating inclusivity in your research and research practices? One thing that concerns you. And then finally, based on what we've discussed, what is one thing that you'll do to foster inclusivity? Just one thing that you'll do to foster inclusivity. All right, thank you.
start to implement, people started implementing ideas right there in the workshop. The form group started really thinking about how to implement some of those ideas. So she recommended Dr. God to us because she was supposed to do this workshop, and I said, send us somebody or recommend somebody that could do justice. And so that's one of the ways that we came along with us. So we appreciate you so very, very much.
Thank you.
And as it turns out, in the evaluation instrument that you have, some of the questions that we asked are there in our own language. It says, what are the most important perspectives gained from this workshop? Just similar to what we talked about. So again, I want to thank you so very, very much. We are unfortunately out of time. Maybe 2 minutes. If there is a burning question that you have in your mind, you can still ask it right now. The time is ticking. 2 minutes. Yes.
So, in one of your slides near the end, you had talked about allowing for multiple forms of expression.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what those forms could be.
Multiple forms of expression?
Yeah. Or how you do them.
Okay. Okay, so two separate questions. Let's see. Forms of expression. Expression could be, and that's very broad, right?
Yeah.
For interpretation. But let's think of this in terms of expression of how people share their ideas. Let me use it from my context, expression. People's contributions to their group. For example, I didn't realize that, okay, when I have new students come to my group, I ask them to fill out a document with 2 columns. What are your current skills, very broadly defined, and then what do you want to learn from participating in the research group with me? And I try not to give them a lot of parameters because I don't want to bias what they think I'm looking for. I didn't realize that I had a social media genius working with me. So I've been able to now leverage that learning, leverage something that he considers himself as an expert, and put it into practice in my work. So now we have a Twitter following, we communicate our research ideas because of his expression of expertise. That's one example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so beyond verbal, you also have this written document where they can think and write their answers, and then also
Right.
on the areas that they're comfortable with, like social.
Right. So expression could show up in different ways depending on your context, but at least from mine, I like to see what are their existing skills or things that they think are skills, and how can I use that? How can I tap into that and use that?
That's a very good question. All right, with that, we call it a wrap. And again, I want to thank you, my staff and Natalia, for always and Susan, for them bringing this workshop. So again, thank you so much for what you do. And for those of you watching it in the video, Natalia can also send you the evaluation instrument to kind of tell us what you think. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here and for your contributions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.